The Vengeance of the Witchfinder by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland, Chapter 14. Down, 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 unspeaking, moving like a robot, Cousin Pelly forced the boys to climb down a winding circular stair. "Where are we going?" Louis asked, but his relative did not reply. "I don't know," said Bertie. He had thought the question was for him. "Was that a trap door we went through?" "Yeah," replied Louis. "It's under a rug in the middle of the front hall floor." I didn't even know it was there," said Bertie. The bony hands gave them a shake, and the boys fell silent. The circular stair twisted downward through a stone-walled shaft, with dim and flickering light coming from candles stuck into sconces on every few steps. The air felt damp and smelled musty, as if the place had been closed off for ages. Finally, they reached the bottom of the stair. Ahead of them loomed a tall, arched door of oak. Pelly shoved them roughly toward this, and it swung open slowly as they approached, although no hand touched it. Louis gasped. Now he knew where they were. The room beyond the door rose to a barrel-arched ceiling. The floor was glistening stone, blackened with age and slippery with moisture. A long table had been set up at the far end. It held a brass candelabrum with 4 tapers burning in it, giving the dismal room the dimmest possible illumination. And, thanks to the uncertain light, Louis could see a miserable figure standing in a kind of waist-high wooden cage to the left of the table. It was his Uncle Jonathan, still in his carrot-colored pajamas and nightcap, with his hands chained in front of him. Louis glared wildly around. Shapes stood in the dark, shadowy corners of the room. Shapes that could be tables or chests or other odds and ends of furniture, only they weren't. Without even being able to see them clearly, Louis knew that they were instruments of torture. This was the abandoned wine cellar that the witchfinder Pruitt had made his headquarters. This was where he tormented and wrung confessions from his hapless victims. This was the courtroom where he held his trials for witchcraft. "The prisoners will be placed in the dock." Louis jerked his gaze back to the table. No one had sat behind it before, but now he saw a tall chair, and in it a spectral form. Old Witchfinder Pruitt, or his ghost, sat there, his bald dome hidden under an elaborate wig. He wore the long black robes of a British judge. Pelly pushed the boys forward, forcing them into the waist-high cage where Uncle Jonathan stood. "Hello, boys," he said, his voice sad and weary. "Louis, I'm sorry I got you into this mess." Despite all his fear and dread, Louis felt like hugging Jonathan. "Gosh, Uncle Jonathan, it's all my fault." "Silence!" Bertie gasped in fear. Louis flinched and looked back at the apparition behind the table. It looked different somehow. Then he realized that the features of the witchfinder were changing from moment to moment. They wavered and swam like a face seen through a window pane, with rain wriggling down over it. One instant, the face was the stern and cunning countenance of a man in hardy middle age. The next, the cheeks and eyes had sunken. The hair had withered away from the temples, and the mouth had gone gap-toothed and slack. It was as if Pruitt were aging from 45 to 100 and then going back again over and over. The other prisoner will enter the dock." Pelly walked stiffly into the now crowded cage. "Mr. Barneveld," whispered Bertie. "Please, sir, snap out of it." Pelly did not respond. He stood staring blindly ahead, his arms slack at the sides. Louis thought desperately of running away, but the moment the thought entered his mind, the door swung closed with a boom, making them start violently. No escape that way. The ghost at the table spoke again. "Prisoners at the bar, 3 of ye stand accused of the most horrible and vile crime of sorcery. Ye are descended from that accursed warlock Martin Barneveld, who did foully enchant me in my days of life and cut short my good work. How do ye plead?" Pelly said nothing, and Louis was too frightened to speak. But Jonathan raised his voice and boomed, "Not guilty, your dishonor!" The ghost continued, as if it had not heard. "The 4th prisoner is a willing accomplice to the crimes of the others. He shall be judged as harshly and delivered to the same punishment as they. The trial will proceed." "You're no judge," said Jonathan in an angry voice. "And this is no trial. You were an evil sorcerer, and you know it. Martin Barnevelt never hurt anyone in his life except you, and you asked for it. We who do the work of good must sometimes employ the methods of the doers of evil, the ghost said. True, I did learn the ways and wiles of sorcery, but that was to entrap the witches that did bedevil our land, and to prolong my days upon the earth, that they might be caught and punished. Jonathan snorted. To Lewis and Bertie he said, Don't believe the old liar. Malachi Pruitt traded his soul for control of an evil spirit. It prolonged his days, all right. He didn't age at all for 50 years, but when Martin Barnevelt banished the spirit, all old Pruitt's evil fell on his shoulders, and the shock turned him into a doddering old man before it killed him. You know about Martin Barnevelt and his magic? Asked Lewis, amazed. He was my ancestor, and yours too, Lewis. Sure, I know all about Martin Barnevelt. Maybe Pelly thought all the old family stories were just fairy tales, but I knew better. Martin Barnevelt studied magic, all right, but he never used it for evil, and the worst day that he ever lived, he was twice as good a man as the wicked witchfinder ever was. The words sounded contemptuous and brave, yet Lewis could see a worried light in his uncle's eyes. That will change, thou miscreant, said the ghost. Thy foolish nephew released the phantom that served me. It summoned my own spirit from its slumber, and allowed me to walk again upon the earth. I spelled the inhabitants of the manor to be my slaves and follow my will, and they released me from the trunk containing my magical They released to me the trunk containing my magical supplies. The sacrifice of a few chickens strengthened me to use those supplies. And when thou and thou sorceress kin are dead, then I shall walk the earth as flesh and blood again, free to find all wickedness and to punish it. What do you mean? Demanded Jonathan. You don't have any jurisdiction over me or my relatives. The apparition laughed in a nasty way. Ha 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 ha! I have the jurisdiction of the righteous, it howled. Behold! Through the mystical knowledge I gained in my long studies, I know a most secret and cunning spell. One by one ye miscreants will roast at the stake for thy sins, and as the life burns from each of ye, I shall gain new life. This ghostly form shall gain flesh and blood, and I shall be man alive again, fit to cleanse this sinful world, and this time I shall succeed, and claim rulership of England, of the whole world. You're crazy, Pruitt, growled Jonathan. Who shall be first? Murmured the ghost. The eldest? The youngest? Shall I give thee a taste of thy doom, thou bearded warlock? The wavering spirit began to chant weird words. In the dock, beside Lewis, Jonathan stiffened. What's wrong, Uncle Jonathan? Asked Lewis. His uncle did not reply. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes squeezed shut in pain. His teeth clenched, and a groan forced its way out. The ghost's chattering stopped, and Jonathan sagged. Whew, he breathed. What's wrong? Squeaked Bertie. Jonathan shook his head. An illusion spell. That flickering phantom had me believing I was lying on a rack with my arms and legs being stretched out of their sockets, and I fell for it. Lewis looked at the ghost. Was it a little more solid? Did its features change more slowly from middle age to decrepitude? He thought they did. Thou starest at me? Grinned the spook. Then sample thy fate, young warlock. Again the ghost chanted. Lewis gasped. The underground dungeon faded away. He was standing in a walled courtyard. His arms had been tied behind him at around a post almost as thick as a telephone pole, and he stood on a jumbled mound of split logs, reeking of pine resin and oak sap. The spirit of the witchfinder planned to burn him at the stake. The moment the thought came to him, Lewis heard the dreadful crackle of fire. He screamed for help, and his shout echoed back at him from the stone walls. Wisps of smoke floated up. Then the smoke grew thicker, ragged and gray. Waves of heat swept up from the wood, choking Lewis. Tears streamed from his eyes. He felt the searing lick of flame blistering his legs. And then the chanting stopped, and he was standing back in the dock. He swayed and gasped. Even the hot, stagnant air seemed cool by comparison with his vivid hallucination, and this time he was sure of it. Old Witchfinder Pruitt was more solid, less transparent than he had been. He lives on other people's pain and fear, Lewis thought confusedly. They made him stronger and more real. And death makes him strongest of all. He vaguely heard his uncle asking, "Louis, are you all right?" An idea came to Louis then. He was crying, but he forced himself to speak boldly. "Yeah, you may burn us all to crisps and become real again, but if you plan to rule the world, you're going to need a crown, and you don't have one because my ancestor took it away from you. And you know what? I hid it where you'll never find it, not in a million years." "What?" thundered the ghost. "Thou hast my crown? I demand it of thee, insolent whelp. Go soak your head," said Louis. The ghost's expression became cagey. "Boy, tell me where thou hast concealed my crown. Do it, and perhaps I shall let thee live. Perhaps I shall even adopt thee as my son. Teach thee the words of command over spirits, that thou shalt be a mighty man of power." Louis blinked. He had not thought of that possibility, although Jonathan fooled around with white magic. Louis had always been frightened to try anything like that. He had been frightened of people and things all his life, he realized. For a moment, he imagined himself wielding sorcerer's power. He could turn all the bullies at school into frogs and mice. He'd be so powerful that nothing could ever hurt him. And never again would he have to be afraid or dream up disasters that might happen to him. But then, hot anger flooded over him. What would be the price of such power? The life of eccentric, likable old Cousin Pelly, of his loyal friend Bertie, of kind and gentle Uncle Jonathan? "No deal," he said. "But here's what I will do. If you'll let us go, I'll get the crown for you. How's that?" Greed and wrath warred in the ghostly face. A sly look replaced them. "Give us the coronet first," the spirit purred, "and then we shall consider what leniency we shall offer thee." "Louis, no!" Bertie cried. "He's trying to trick you." Louis ignored his friend. "Okay, I'll do it," he said. "You'll have to let me go to get it, though." "My slave shall go with thee." Louis looked up at Jonathan and gave him a wink. Jonathan looked startled for a moment, but he raised no objection when Louis stepped out of the dock. Louis walked to the door. It swung open at his approach. All the way back to the study, Cousin Pelly plodded right along behind him. He had no chance to make a break for it. But Louis had no plans to run away. In the study, he reached down in the drawer where he had hidden the crown. He busied himself doing something to it for a moment, and then he straightened. He walked past Pelly and downstairs again, with his hypnotized old relative trudging right along behind him. Down he went again, down that spiral staircase to the horribly gruesome underground chamber. The scene had not changed. Jonathan and Bertie still cowered in the dock. The wavering form of Witchfinder Pruitt still shimmered behind the table. Its eyes glowed a hungry red the second Louis entered with the coronet. "Mine!" screeched the spectral creature. "Mine the just rewards of my diligence and cleverness, stolen from me by your ancestor. Approach, boy. Crown me King of England, of the world." Louis licked his lips. He hated to draw near the eerie creature, but he had to do it. He edged around the table. He stood beside the high-backed chair. "Crown me," the spirit ordered again. He can't pick it up, Louis realized. The ghost might have the power to materialize, and it might even be solid enough for the crown to sit on its head and not sink through like a spoon sliding into jello, but it wasn't real enough to grasp material objects. This was why it had entranced Jenkins and Mrs. Goodring and Cousin Pelly. The most it could do was float trunks downstairs or make doors open and close by themselves. Louis raised the coronet and held it over the ghost's head. The judge's wig faded and vanished, leaving the patchy bald head of Witchfinder Pruitt exposed. Slowly, Louis lowered the crown into place. It settled on the ghost's head. Both of Louis's hands felt cold, as if he had stuck them into the icebox. "Ha!" exclaimed the ghost. "What is rightfully mine has been returned. Now, foolish boy, thou shalt die, thou and all thine accursed kin." "Yeah? You sure you can pull that off? What if you're wearing the amulet of Constantine around your stupid head?" "What?" the ghost shrieked. Louis had wound the chain of the amulet around the crown again, just as he had found it, and he had tucked the amulet into the network of gold filigree among the emeralds and rubies. Now the glass tube suddenly dropped free and dangled on its chain right between Witchfinder Pruitt's hollow eyes. "Attaboy, Louis!" yelled Jonathan, and immediately he began to chant something. The glass tube lit up with a supernatural glow. The ghost of the witchfinder leaped out of its seat, clawing at the crown, but the coronet had frozen itself to his skull. The ghost rose into the air, whirled, screamed, and screeched, and all the time the amulet shone brighter and brighter. Its green glow, an alarming change, flowed over Pruitt's feet. In its green glow, an alarming change flooded over Pruitt's features. He grew older by the second. He looked 100 years old. Then he was like a living mummy, with his skin stretched horribly over his bones, so tight that it split and peeled away. His teeth showed in a grimace. The lips and gums shrank away from them until they were bare, yellow, and dry. The witchfinder became a rattling skeleton, his black judge's robes flanking away to nothing. And then Jonathan's chanting voice rose in a mighty crescendo. The amulet gave a final brilliant flash. In its unearthly light, Lewis saw the writhing skeleton silently explode into a cloud of gray dust, and the coronet fell from empty air to clatter on the table. Lewis snatched it up. In the sudden darkness, he heard the clink and clank of chains. "What happened? What happened?" bawled Bertie. "Lewis just saved our hides," yelled Jonathan. "The chains have dropped away from my wrists and ankles. You did it, Lewis. The amulet sent old Witchfinder Pruitt back to the grave. We're free." And that is the end of chapter 14.